Mistress Mary quite contrary. Mary had liked to look at her mother from a distance. She had thought she was very pretty. But as she knew very little of her, she could scarcely have been expected to love her or miss her very much when she was gone. She did not miss her at all, in fact, and she was a self-absorbed child. She always gave her entire thought to herself, as she had always done. If she had been older, she would no doubt been very anxious at being left alone in the world, but she was very young, and she had always been taken care of. She supposed she always would be. What she thought was that she would like to know if she was going to nice people, who would be polite to her and give her her own way, as her ayah and other native servants had done. She knew that she was not going to stay at the English clergyman's house where she was taken first. She did not want to stay. The English clergyman was poor, and he had 5 children nearly all the same age. They wore shabby clothes and were always quarrelling and snatching toys from each other. Mary hated their untidy bungalow, and was so disagreeable to them that after the first day or two nobody would play with her. By the second day they had given her a nickname which made her furious. It was Basil who thought of it first. Basil was a little boy with impudent blue eyes and a turned-up nose, and Mary hated him. She was playing by herself under a tree, and just as she'd been playing the day the cholera broke out. She was making heaps of earth and paths for a garden, and Basil came and stood near to her to watch. Presently he got rather interested and made a sudden suggestion. "Why don't you put a heap of the rocks there and pretend it's a rockery?" he said. "There, in the middle." And he leaned in to point her. "Go away!" cried Mary. "I don't want boys. Go away!" For a moment Basil looked angry, and then he began to tease. He was always teasing his sisters. He danced around and around her and made faces and sang and laughed. "Mistress Mary, quite contrary, how does your garden grow? With silver bells and cockerel shells and marigolds all in a row." He sang it until all the other children heard and laughed too. And the crosser Mary got, the more they sang, "Mistress Mary, quite contrary." And after that, all as long as she stayed with them, they called her Mistress Mary quite contrary, when they spoke to her and to each other, and often when they spoke to her. "You're going to be sent home," Basil said to her, "at the end of the week, and we are glad of it." "I'm glad of it too," Mary answered. "Where is home?" "She doesn't know where home is," said Basil, with a 7-year-old scorn. "It's England, of course. Our grandmamma lives there, and our sister Mabel was sent to her last year. You're not going to your grandma. You have none. You are going to your uncle. His name is Mr. Archibald Crayford." "I don't know anything of him," snapped Mary. "I know you don't," Basil answered. "You don't know anything. Girls never do. I heard father and mother talking about him. He lives in a great big desolate old house in the country, and no one goes near him. He's so cross he won't let them in, and they wouldn't come if he would let them. He's a hunchback, and he's horrid." "I don't believe you," said Mary, and she turned her back and stuck her fingers in her ears, because she would not listen any more. But she thought it over a great deal afterwards, and Miss Crawford told her that night that she was going to sail away to England in a few days to go with her uncle, Mr. Archibald Craven, who lived in Misselthwaite Manor. She looked so stony and stubborn and uninterested that they did not know what to think about her. They tried to be kind to her, but she only turned her face away when Miss Crawford attempted to kiss her, and held stiffly when Miss Crawford patted her shoulder. "She is such a plain child," Miss Crawford said pityingly afterwards, "and her mother was such a pretty creature. She has a very pretty manner too, and Mary is the most unattractive ways I've ever seen a child. The children call her Miss Mary quite contrary, and although it's naughty of them, one can't help but understand it. Perhaps if her mother had carried her pretty face and her pretty manners oftener into the nursery, Mary might have learned some pretty ways too. It's very sad how the poor thing is gone, but to remember that many people never even knew she was a child at all. I believe she scarcely ever looked at her," sighed Miss Crawford, "and when her ayah was dead there was no one to give a second thought to the little thing. Think of the servants running away, leaving her alone in that desert bungalow. Colonel McGrew said he nearly jumped out of his skin when he opened the door and found her standing by herself in the middle of the room." Mary had made the long voyage to England under the care of an officer's wife, who was taking her children to leave them in a boarding school. She was very much absorbed in her own little boy and girl, and was rather glad to hand the child over to the woman Miss Archibald Craven had sent to meet her in London. The woman was his housekeeper at Misselthwaite Manor, and her name was Miss Medlock. She was a stout woman with red cheeks and sharp black eyes. She wore a very purple dress. The black silk mantle with a jet fringe on it, and the black bonnet with the purple velvet flowers which stuck up and trembled when she moved her head. Mary did not like her at all, but, as she was very seldom liked people, and there was nothing remarkable at that. Besides, it was very evident that Miss Medlock did not think much of her. "My word, she's such a plain little piece of goods," she said. "And we heard that her mother was quite the beauty. She hasn't handed much of that down, has she, ma'am?" "Perhaps she will improve as she grows older," the officer's wife said good-naturedly. "If she were not so shallow, and had a nicer expression. Her features are rather good. Children alter so much." "She'll have to alter a good great deal," answered Miss Medlock. "There's nothing likely to improve the child's at Misselworth, if you ask me." They thought Mary was not listening because of her standing a little apart from them at the window of the private hotel they had gone to, as she was watching the buses and cabs and people, but she heard quite well, and was made very curious about her uncle and the place they lived in. What sort of place was it? And what would it be like? What was a hunchback? She had never seen one. Perhaps there are none in India. Since she had been living in other people's houses, and had no ayah, she began to feel lonely, and think queer thoughts which were new to her. She had begun to wonder why she never seemed to belong to anyone, even when her father and mother had been alive. Other children seemed to belong to their family, with their fathers and mothers, but she had never really been anyone's little girl. She had had servants, and food, and clothes, but no one had ever taken any notice of her. She did not know that this was because she was a disagreeable child, but then, of course, she did not know that she was disagreeable. She often thought that other people were, but she did not know that she was herself. So she thought Miss Medlock was the most disagreeable person she had ever seen. But with her common high-coloured face, and her common fine bonnet, when the next day they set on a journey to Yorkshire, she walked through the station to the railway carriage with her head up, trying to keep as far away from her as she could, because she did not want to seem to belong to her. It would have made her very angry for people to think that she was her little girl. But Miss Medlock was not the least bit disturbed by her and her thoughts. She was the kind of woman who would stand no nonsense from young ones. At least, that is what she would have said when she had been asked. She had not wanted to go to London just when her sister Maria's daughter was going to be married, but she had been comfortable at a well-paid place as housekeeper at Misselthwaite Manor, and the only way in which she could keep it was to do it at once, what Miss Marchwood had told her to do. She had never dared to ask the question. "Captain Lennox and his wife died of cholera," Mr. Craven had said in his short, cold way. "Captain Lennox was my brother's wife, and now I am their child's guardian. The child is to be brought here. You will go to London and bring her yourself." So she packed her small trunk and made the journey. Mary sat in the corner of the railway carriage, and looked plain and fretful. She had nothing to read or look at. She folded her thin little black-gloved hands in her lap. Her black dress made her look yellower than ever. Her limp light hair strangled under her black crape hat. A more marred-looking young one I never saw in my life, Miss Medlock thought. Marred is a Yorkshire word for spoiled and pettish. She had never seen a child who sat so still without doing anything. At the last she got tired of watching her, and began to talk in a brisk, hard voice. "I suppose I may as well tell you something about where you're going, too. Do you know anything about your uncle?" "No," said Mary. "Never heard your father or mother talk about him?" "No," said Mary, frowning. She frowned because she remembered her father and mother had never talked to her about anything in particular. Certainly they had never told her of things. "Humph!" muttered Miss Medlock, staring at her queer, unresponsive little face. She did not say any more for a few moments, and then she began again. "Well, I suppose you might as well be told some things to prepare yourself. You're going to a queer place." Mary said nothing at all, and Miss Medlock looked rather discomforted by her apparent indifference. But after taking a breath, she went on. "Not but that it's a grand place in a gloomy way. Mr. Craven is proud of it in his way, and that's the gloomy enough too. The house is 600 years old, and on the edge of the moor. There is near 100 rooms in it, although most of them are shut up and locked. And there are pictures and fine old furniture and things that have been there for ages. There is a big park around it, and gardens and trees with branches trailing to the ground. Some of them—" She paused and took another breath. "But there's nothing else," she ended suddenly. Mary had begun to listen in spite of herself. It all sounded so unlike India, and anything new rather attracted her, but she did not intend to look as if she were interested. That was her one unhappy, disagreeable way of things. So she sat still. "Well," said Miss Wedlock, "what do you think of it?" "Nothing," she answered. "I know nothing of such places." That made Miss Medlock laugh in a short sort of laugh. "Eh," you said, "but you are like an old woman. Don't you care?" "It doesn't matter," said Mary, "whether I care or not." "You are right enough there," said Miss Medlock. "It doesn't. That's where you are kept at the Misworth mansion, and I don't know. Unless because it's easier that way. He's not going to trouble himself about you. That's sure and certain. He never troubles himself about no one." She stopped herself, just as she remembered something in time. "He's got a crooked back," she said. "That set him wrong. He was a young, sour man, and got no good at all from his money in the big place until he was married." Mary's eyes turned towards him in spite of her intention to seem like not to care. She had never thought of a hunchback being married, and she was a trifle surprised. Miss Medlock saw this, and she was a talkative woman, so she continued with more interest. "This is one way of passing things sometime, at any rate. She was a sweet, pretty thing, and he'd have walked to the world to get her a blade of grass that she wanted. Nobody thought she'd marry him, but she did, and people said she married him for his money, but she didn't. She didn't. Positively. When she died—" Mary gave an involuntary little jump. "Oh, did she die?" she exclaimed, quite without meaning to. She just remembered a French fairy story she had heard once, called Riquet à la Houppe. It had been about a poor hunchback and a beautiful princess, and it made her suddenly sorry for Miss Crève. "Yes, she died," Miss Medlock answered, "and it made him queerer than ever. He cares about nobody. He won't see people. Most of the time he goes away, and when he's at the Misselthwaite he shuts himself up in the west wing and won't let anyone but Pitcher see him. Pitcher's an old fellow, but he took care of him when he was a child, and he knows his ways." This sounded like something in a book, but it did not make Mary feel cheerful. In a house with 100 rooms, nearly all shut up with doors locked, a house on the edge of a moor, whatsoever a moor was, sounded dreary, and a man with a crooked back who shut himself up also. She stared out the window, her lips pinched together, and it seemed quite natural that the rain should have begun to pour into the grey, slanting tiles, and splash and stream down the window panes. If the pretty wife had been alive, maybe she might have made things cheerful by being her own mother, and by running in and out and going to parties as she'd done in the frocks full of lace. But she was not there any more. You needn't expect to see him, because 10 to 1 you won't," said Miss Medlock. "And you mustn't expect that there will be anyone to talk to you. You'll have to play about and look after yourself. You'll be told what rooms you can go in and what rooms to keep out of. There's gardens enough, but when you're in the house, don't go wandering and poking about. Mr. Craven won't have it." "I shall not want to go poking about," said sour little Mary, and just as suddenly she begun to be rather sorry for Mr. Crabham. She began to cease feeling sorry, and to think he was unpleasant enough to deserve all that had happened to him. She turned her face away to the streaming panels of the window and the railway carriage, and gazed out at the grey rainstorm which looked as if it would go on for ever and ever. She watched it so long and steadily that the greyness grew heavier and heavier before her eyes as she began to fall asleep.